You are mine for 90 days, the millionaire declared, but one kiss changed forever. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The rain drummed softly against the tall glass windows of the Reed Tower, a silver building slicing through the fog over downtown Manhattan. Inside, under the golden light of an office chandelier, Alexander Reed stood near the edge of his desk. Sharp suit, sharp jawline, sharper eyes. He had built an empire before 35, a man who turned numbers into power and power into armor. But tonight, there was something different in the room. The woman sitting across from him was not like the others who usually crossed his path. Her name was Lena Hart, an artist who once sold hand-painted postcards in Central Park and was now sitting in front of a billionaire who spoke her name like a contract. "Marry me," Alexander said evenly, sliding a leather folder across the glass. "Think of it as a business arrangement." Lena blinked, startled. Her hands tightened around the chipped coffee mug she had been holding since she stepped into his office, the only thing she could afford that day. "A business arrangement?" she repeated, her voice trembling but steady enough to hold her dignity. Alexander's tone did not waver. "My shareholders want stability. A marriage will stop the rumors and restore confidence after my last fiancé ran off with my competitor." He paused, studying her face. "In return, your mother's hospital bills will be covered, and your art studio will reopen under your name." The fluorescent light caught the raindrops sliding down the glass behind him, reflecting off the platinum ring sitting quietly on the folder. Lena gave a bitter laugh. "So, you are buying a wife." "I am buying time," he corrected, his voice calm but heavy. 6 months. No strings. You will have your freedom after that." Her pulse thundered in her ears. She thought about her mother lying in a hospital bed in Queens, the eviction notice taped to her apartment door, the last sketch she could not finish because she could no longer afford paint. Pride had been her last currency, and now it was being tested. She looked up at the man whose face was carved out of confidence and loneliness. "You said 6 months?" He nodded once. "Then we are even. I will marry you, but do not ever treat me like something you own." For the first time, his gaze softened. He slid the folder toward her, a faint curve appearing at the corner of his lips. "I would never own you, Mrs. Reed," he murmured. "I will only break your pride." Lena hesitated for a heartbeat before signing. Outside, thunder rolled over the city. In that single stroke of ink, two worlds collided: the struggling artist, who had nothing left to lose, and the millionaire, who had everything but warmth. Neither of them knew that this contract would not just change their fates, it would break them both open in ways they never imagined. The morning after the contract was signed, Lena Hart stood inside a marble hallway that seemed to stretch forever. Every step echoed off the polished floor as if the walls themselves were judging her presence. A housekeeper opened the tall double doors to reveal the Reed mansion, a world of chandeliers, mirrored corridors, and silence so thick it almost had weight. Alexander's voice carried from the grand staircase. "You will stay here for the next 6 months," he said, his tone measured, distant. "A driver and staff are assigned to you. The media will think we are newlyweds, so we must appear convincing." Lena's fingers brushed the ring on her hand. It was heavier than she remembered. She lifted her chin slightly. "Convincing does not mean obedient, Mr. Reed." His gaze flickered, but he said nothing. The day unfolded like a performance. She was fitted for designer gowns, coached by a stylist to walk and smile for photographs. Cameras followed them as they exited the penthouse, her arm looped awkwardly through his. Reporters shouted questions, and flashes painted her face white. Every smile felt rehearsed, every laugh calculated. Inside the limousine, she exhaled, the tension draining from her shoulders. "You do not need to act so tense," Alexander said, scrolling through his phone. "I am not used to pretending," she answered. He glanced up briefly. "Then pretend better." The words stung more than she expected. That night, she wandered through the mansion's garden, the air crisp with the scent of rain. Beyond the trimmed hedges and stone fountains, the city glowed in the distance like a faraway promise. For the first time in weeks, she felt the quiet press of loneliness. The next morning, Alexander's assistant handed her a schedule. Dinners, charity galas, photo shoots. It was a world of flashbulbs and handshakes, of laughter that never reached the eyes. At the first gala, a woman in a diamond dress leaned close to Lena and whispered, "You must feel lucky, darling. Most women would kill to be in your position." Lena smiled politely and replied, "Luck has little to do with survival." Across the room, Alexander heard it and paused mid-conversation. For a brief second, something like admiration passed through his expression. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the champagne glasses sat half empty, Lena found him on the balcony, looking out over the city. "You play your role well," he said quietly. "So do you," she replied, wrapping his jacket tighter around her shoulders. He raised an eyebrow. "My jacket looks better on you. It feels warmer than your words," she said. A faint smile touched his lips. He turned back to the skyline. "You think this marriage is only about power, but you will learn power can be lonely too." She looked at him, her eyes softer now. "Loneliness is not power, Alexander. It is punishment." The wind rustled the ivy along the stone railing. He said nothing more. Somewhere behind them, the clock in the hall struck midnight. Over the next few weeks, something unspoken began to shift. He would pause during their public appearances when she laughed genuinely, as if seeing a color he had forgotten existed. She noticed the fatigue behind his perfection, the quiet sadness when he thought no one was watching. They were bound by paper and rules, yet the walls between them began to crack. Still, the contract hung like a shadow. Every time her heart softened, she would remember the moment he said, "I will break your pride." It echoed louder than the city outside. But pride was the only thing keeping her from falling for a man who did not believe in love. Weeks passed inside the Reed mansion, and the walls that once felt like a cage began to shift into something softer, something Lena could almost call familiar. The staff who used to speak to her with cautious formality now smiled when she entered the kitchen, offering her tea or small talk about the weather. She spent her mornings painting in a quiet sunroom that faced the garden, the first time she had touched a brush since her mother's surgery. Sometimes she would catch Alexander passing by, watching her for a moment longer than he meant to, his expression unreadable. One evening, as rain began to patter against the glass roof, she found him in the library, surrounded by open files and untouched scotch. His tie hung loose, his posture unguarded. "You work even when the world sleeps," she said lightly. He looked up, surprised but not displeased. "Sleep is for people who have something to dream about." She stepped closer. "You do not?" He gave a dry laugh. "Dreams are for artists. I am just an accountant of ambition." Her lips curved. "Then maybe you need better math." The faintest smile appeared before he returned his gaze to the papers. "Sit. Tell me about your mother," he said suddenly. The question caught her off guard. She spoke softly, telling him about the hospital visits, the smell of disinfectant, the sound of her mother's laughter fading with each passing month. Alexander listened without interrupting, his usual sharpness replaced by a quiet attentiveness. When she finally stopped, the room felt warmer somehow. "She sounds strong," he said. "She was," Lena whispered. "She taught me that love is not about control." He nodded slowly, his eyes lowering to the contract lying on the table between them. "Maybe that is why I have failed at it." The next morning, news headlines splashed across every business site. A photograph of Alexander and Lena at the gala was accompanied by the words, "The billionaire's contract bride." Rumors spread like wildfire, claiming she had married him for money. Reporters camped outside the gates. When Lena confronted Alexander, her voice trembled with anger. "You said this would protect us from scandal. Now it is worse than before." He set his glass down. "I am handling it." "Handling it?" she repeated, disbelief flooding her tone. "You are the one who put me in this position. You do not get to fix me like another line item on your agenda." He stood abruptly. "You wanted the money, the security, the chance to save your mother. Do not pretend this was not your choice." The words hit harder than he intended. She stared at him, eyes glistening but dry. "You think pride is a weakness, Alexander. But it is the only thing I own." She walked out before he could respond, her footsteps echoing through the empty corridor. That night, Alexander stood alone in the rain, outside the glass hallway, staring at her studio lights flickering in the distance. Inside, Lena sat before her half-finished painting, her brush frozen midair. The colors blurred through her tears. Neither of them slept. The next morning, he called for her, but she was gone. A single note sat on the easel. "You cannot buy honesty with contracts." He read it twice, his chest tightening. For the first time in his life, Alexander Reed felt something he could not quantify or control: regret. He turned toward the window, the city stretching endlessly below, and realized that breaking her pride had cost him the only person who had ever seen through his armor. 3 days passed before anyone saw Lena again. She had returned to her old neighborhood in Queens, where the air smelled of rain and fried food from the corner diner. The tiny apartment she once shared with her mother was empty now, filled only with dust and the faint echo of memories. She unpacked her brushes and began painting again, this time not for galleries or contracts, but to quiet her heart. Across the city, Alexander Reed sat in his penthouse, staring at the unsigned termination papers for their marriage agreement. His lawyer had urged him to end it quickly before the board of directors demanded answers, but his hand refused to move. Every page he looked at reminded him of her voice, her fire, her pride. His phone buzzed with calls from investors, headlines screaming about the vanishing contract bride, but he ignored them all. Instead, he found himself driving through Queens that evening, stopping outside a small cafe, when he saw her silhouette through the window. Lena was bent over a canvas, her hair tied up messily, the light from a single bulb soft on her face. She looked alive in a way she never had in his marble mansion. He did not go inside. He watched her for a few minutes, then left quietly, his chest tightening with something new and unfamiliar. The next morning, Alexander walked into his board meeting. The room fell silent as he entered. One of the older executives spoke first. "Mr. Reed, the press has become uncontrollable. We need a statement. End the arrangement." Alexander stood tall, his tone firm. "There is no arrangement anymore. There is only truth. I married her. She was real, and I will not use her name for damage control." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. After the meeting, he called a press conference. Cameras flashed as he stood behind the podium, the skyline glowing behind him. "Lena Hart did not marry me for money," he said into the microphones. "She married me because I asked her to. The shame is mine, not hers." The room went silent. Somewhere in Queens, Lena watched the broadcast from a CAF television, her brush frozen midair. She could barely believe what she was hearing. Alexander's voice was steady, raw, stripped of the arrogance she once despised. "If the world wants to talk about pride," he continued, "then let them know she never lost hers." The next day, a delivery arrived at Lena's CAF. Inside the box was a single key and a note written in Alexander's handwriting. "For when you are ready to see what honesty looks like." Curiosity warred with caution, but that evening she followed the address on the envelope. It led her to an old warehouse on the East River. The doors opened to reveal a breathtaking gallery space. Her paintings hung on the walls, each framed carefully, each lit by soft golden light. The exhibition title read, "Unbroken, the Art of Lena Hart." At the center of the room stood Alexander. No cameras, no press, just him. "You did this?" she whispered. "You said I could not buy honesty," he replied. "So I earned it." Tears welled in her eyes, the kind she had fought back for too long. "Why?" she asked. He stepped closer, his voice low but certain. "Because breaking your pride only showed me how empty my own life was. I do not want to own you, Lena. I want to deserve you." For the first time, her heart softened completely. She reached out, her fingers brushing the sleeve of his suit. The air between them was heavy, alive. "Then stop talking," she whispered, "and prove it." The city lights shimmered through the windows as he took her hand. In that quiet space, surrounded by her art, the contract that once bound them had dissolved into something stronger than any signature could ever promise. The night of the gallery opening marked a quiet turning point in both of their lives. For the first time, Alexander and Lena stood side by side without pretense, without cameras, and without the weight of a contract hanging over them. Guests wandered through the space, admiring her work, unaware that each painting on the wall told the story of how two broken people had found each other in the unlikeliest way. When the crowd finally dispersed, the soft hum of city traffic filled the silence. Alexander turned to her. "You did this," she said, her voice trembling between gratitude and disbelief. He smiled faintly. "No, you did. I only gave it a place to shine." For the first time since they met, Lena did not feel like she was standing in someone else's world. She felt seen, and it terrified her. "You know this does not erase what happened," she murmured. He nodded slowly. "I know, but maybe it is a beginning." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for deceit, for arrogance, for the man who once said he would break her pride. Instead, she saw something she had never seen before: vulnerability. The next few weeks were different. Alexander began visiting the gallery every evening after work. He would help her adjust the lighting, carry canvases, or simply sit in silence while she painted. Their conversations were quieter, deeper. Sometimes they would argue, but it was no longer about control, it was about truth. One evening she asked, "Do you ever miss the man you were before all this?" He thought for a moment. "No," he said honestly, "because I never liked him." The simplicity of his answer struck her harder than any apology could. Days later, she invited him to meet her mother at the hospital for the first time since her recovery. Her mother, still weak but smiling, squeezed his hand gently. "Take care of her," she said softly. "She has spent her life taking care of everyone else." Alexander nodded, humbled in a way words could not describe. That night Lena stood by the window of her apartment, looking at the reflection of the city lights on the river. Alexander joined her, his jacket draped loosely over his shoulders. "You know," he said, "I used to think power meant control. Now I think it means responsibility." She turned to him, smiling faintly. "And love?" He paused, then whispered, "Love means letting go of control." The next morning, they stood together at the same courthouse where their marriage had begun. But this time there were no lawyers, no witnesses, and no signatures. Alexander pulled a small box from his coat pocket. Inside was the same platinum ring, but the inscription had changed. It now read, "No contracts, only choice." Lena's breath caught as he knelt down, his eyes steady on hers. "This time," he said, "there are no terms, no expiration dates, only what we choose every day." Her eyes glistened. "And what if I choose you?" she whispered. He smiled. "Then I am the richest man alive." As she placed her hand in his, the courthouse bell rang softly in the distance, as if the city itself was giving its blessing. That evening they returned to the gallery where it had all begun. The painting titled "Break Me Gently" hung in the center, glowing under a pool of light. Alexander wrapped his arm around her shoulders and whispered, "You were right all along. Pride does not break us. It saves us until love is ready to take over." Lena leaned into him, smiling through her tears. "And you," she said softly, "you finally learned how to love without owning." Outside, the city lights flickered like a living heartbeat. For two souls who had once signed a deal to survive, they had found something far greater than survival. They had found home in each other. Months passed, and the life they built together settled into something beautifully ordinary. Lena's art studio became a sanctuary filled with laughter, music, and the smell of paint, while Alexander's world of boardrooms and deadlines slowly learned to make room for warmth. Each morning, she would hand him coffee in a paper cup before he left for work, teasing him about his perfect suits and serious expressions. Each night he would return to find her barefoot on the balcony, sketching the skyline as if she was trying to capture time itself. One evening, as the summer air turned warm and the city hummed below, Alexander stood behind her, wrapping his arms gently around her waist. "You know," he murmured, "I used to look at this city and see nothing but profit margins. Now, I see you in every light." She laughed softly, leaning back against his chest. "That is dangerously close to poetry, Mr. Reed." He smiled. "Then I must be improving." Their laughter faded into comfortable silence, broken only by the rhythm of the streets below. For the first time in his life, Alexander Reed felt at peace. But peace has a way of being tested. 2 months later, a sudden market crash hit his company, and the same investors who once praised him now circled like wolves. Newspapers resurrected the old contract marriage scandal, twisting the truth into something poisonous. Lena saw the headlines before he did. When he returned home that night, his tie loosened, eyes weary, she met him at the door. "Tell me this is not true," she said, holding up her phone. The headline read, "Billionaire's Wife Exposed as Strategic Cover." Up. His silence spoke louder than denial. "Lena," he began, but she stepped back, her voice trembling. "I stood beside you when the world doubted us. I defended you. But if you let them write my story like I was just another investment, then you never really saw me at all." He took a step forward. "That is not what this is. They are trying to destroy everything we built." "No," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "They are reminding me that you built this world to win, not to feel." She turned away, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the apartment. The next morning, Alexander faced the press again. His voice was steady, but inside he was unraveling. "There will always be those who mistake vulnerability for weakness," he said into the sea of microphones. "But the truth is, I did marry her for a reason. She was my reason to change." Cameras flashed, questions shouted, but he no longer heard them. Across town, Lena sat alone in her studio, the morning light spilling across unfinished canvases. One painting caught her eye, the first portrait she had ever made of him. His expression in the painting was softer, human, almost fragile. She touched the dried paint with her fingertips, realizing she had captured a man learning to love, not a man trying to win. That evening she showed up at the press building just as Alexander was leaving through the back door. The rain had returned, soaking the pavement. When he saw her, he stopped, uncertain. She walked up to him, her hair damp, her voice quiet but sure. "You once said you wanted to earn honesty," she said. "Then stop defending yourself and start living it." He met her gaze, something breaking open behind his eyes. "Lena, I am sorry," he said. "Not for the headlines. For forgetting what matters." She reached out, brushing his wet sleeve. "Then come home. We will rebuild not your empire, but us." In that moment, the noise of the world faded, and for the first time, the storm felt like forgiveness. They walked home together under a single umbrella, two people who had signed a contract once to protect themselves, now bound only by choice and the courage to start again. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were real. The headlines eventually faded, replaced by new scandals and newer distractions, and Alexander began rebuilding his company from the inside out. He no longer hid behind walls of power or polished speeches. Instead, he faced every meeting, every boardroom, and every failure with a calm honesty that disarmed even his fiercest critics. Lena stood by his side through it all, not as a decoration or a distraction, but as his equal. She reopened her studio to host free art classes for children and working mothers, using the gallery Alexander had given her as a space for hope. Sometimes he would visit during his lunch breaks, watching her teach with paint-splattered hands and the kind of laughter that came from peace. One afternoon, he brought her coffee and leaned against the doorframe, smiling as he watched her comfort a little boy who had accidentally spilled paint across the floor. "You are good at this," he said. She looked up, grinning. "At cleaning up messes or creating them?" He chuckled. "Both." For the first time, his smile reached his eyes. Their love had grown quieter, deeper, no longer built on apologies but on choices. Yet peace has a way of testing the strong. When Alexander's company prepared to merge with an international investor, the same board members who once doubted him insisted that Lena should stay out of sight during negotiations. "They will take you more seriously without her," one executive said bluntly. Alexander looked at the man, his jaw tightening. "Then they are not the kind of partners I want." That night, he told Lena what had happened. She listened silently, then said, "You do not have to fight every battle for me." He took her hand gently. "I am not fighting for you. I am fighting for us, because I spent years building a world that shut people like you out, and I will not live in that world anymore." The truth of it struck her deeper than any grand gesture could. The following morning, during the final negotiation, Lena entered the boardroom uninvited, holding a folder of her artwork inspired by Alexander's story. The investors fell silent as she placed it on the table. "This is what your partnership represents," she said. "Not numbers, people, change. A company that learns to feel again." For a long moment no one spoke. Then the lead investor, an older man with kind eyes, nodded slowly. "I think we can work with that," he said. The room erupted in quiet approval. Later, when everyone had gone, Alexander turned to her, awe flickering across his face. "You just saved the deal," he said. She smiled softly. "No, we saved it together." That evening, as they left the building hand in hand, the city lights reflected in the glass walls around them, turning their silhouettes into something timeless. They had once built their story on pride and survival, but now it stood on truth. And truth, they realized, was the most powerful foundation of all. The months that followed marked a new chapter for both of them, one built not on contracts or conditions, but on trust and understanding. Alexander and Lena had turned the Reed Foundation into a project that merged business with compassion, funding art therapy programs for hospitals and schools. Every morning they would leave their apartment together, sometimes in silence, sometimes laughing over burnt toast or mismatched socks. Life was imperfect, but it was theirs. Yet one evening, an unexpected storm rolled over the city. Alexander was still at the office finalizing the merger documents when a sudden power outage swept through the building. The emergency lights flickered as he glanced at the clock. It was already past midnight. He tried calling Lena, but the line went dead. Somewhere in the distance, thunder cracked like a warning. At that same moment, Lena was in her studio, preparing paintings for an upcoming exhibition when she heard glass shatter. A short circuit had sparked a small fire near the entrance. Smoke began to fill the air. Panic rose in her chest as she tried to grab the nearest extinguisher, but the flames spread faster than she could contain them. Alexander arrived minutes later, the street already glowing orange. Firefighters were battling the blaze, shouting orders over the chaos. He pushed through the barrier, his voice breaking. "Lena, she is inside." The chief held him back, but before anyone could stop him, Alexander ran into the building. The heat was unbearable, smoke clawing at his throat as he shouted her name. Through the haze, he saw her crouched near the back door, coughing, clutching a small painting to her chest. He reached her just as a beam cracked above them. Wrapping his arms around her, he pulled her through the smoke, shielding her with his body until they burst into the open air. The crowd gasped as firefighters rushed to help. Lena's face was streaked with ash, but she was alive. She looked at him, her voice trembling. "You came for me." His voice was rough from the smoke. "There was never a world where I would not." Hours later, they sat together on the curb, blankets over their shoulders as dawn crept over the skyline. The gallery was gone, reduced to embers and silence, but in that loss came clarity. Lena turned to him, eyes shining in the pale light. "Everything we built, it is gone." Alexander shook his head softly. "No, the building is gone. What we built is still here." He touched his chest, then hers. She leaned into him, exhaustion giving way to peace. The painting she had tried to save rested between them, half-burned but still showing the faint outline of their silhouettes, two figures standing under the same light. He smiled faintly. "You always said art tells the truth. Maybe this is the truth of us." She nodded, tears falling freely now. "We break, we burn, we rebuild. Together." And as the first rays of sun warmed the ashes, they both knew that this fire had not ended their story. It had forged it. 6 months after the fire, the city had already forgotten the headlines. But for Alexander and Lena, those flames had become the beginning of something new. The Reed Foundation reopened in a renovated riverside building, this time with walls lined not with corporate art but with paintings created by children, patients, and young artists from every corner of the city. Lena stood in the middle of the new gallery, her hands lightly dusted with paint, as volunteers arranged the final pieces for the grand reopening. Outside, a soft winter snow began to fall, catching in her hair. Alexander entered quietly, his coat still damp from the cold. He paused at the doorway, watching her as she adjusted a frame on the wall. She turned and smiled. "You are late," she said. He grinned. "You start a fire and rebuild an empire without me? And I am the one who is late?" She laughed, the sound soft and familiar, echoing through the room. He stepped closer, handing her a small velvet box. "Before you open it," he said, "know that this one does not come with a contract." Her heart fluttered. She opened the box to find a simple gold band, engraved with the words, "Break me gently." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked up at him. "You kept the phrase," she whispered. "It started everything," he replied. "And it reminds me that love is not about winning. It is about surrender." He took her hands, his voice steady. "I do not need a ceremony or a crowd. I just need you to say yes again. Not because you have to, but because you want to." She smiled through her tears. "Then yes," she said softly. 1,000 times yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and the gallery lights reflected off the gold, scattering tiny sparks of light across the walls like stars. Outside, the snow thickened, blanketing the city in white silence. Later that evening, the guests arrived, filling the new foundation with laughter and warmth. No one knew the full story behind the couple who greeted them at the entrance, only that their love seemed carved out of something unshakable. As the night drew to a close, Lena walked to the center of the room where a new painting was displayed. It was titled, "The Art of Becoming," showing two figures standing amid a field of ash, holding hands under a rising Sunday. She felt Alexander's arms slide around her shoulders as he whispered, "You turned our scars into color." She leaned against him. "And you turned power into purpose." The room fell quiet for a moment, filled only with the soft hum of music and the distant sound of the river outside. Alexander kissed her forehead and said, "We were two people who signed a deal out of desperation, but love turned it into a promise." She smiled, her voice barely above a whisper. "The best mistake we ever made." Outside the window, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in light. And for Alexander Reed and Lena Hart, the story that began as a contract ended as a love that no fire could ever burn away.